All right, it's 10:02. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the March 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary. I work on Blueprint user support and communications in the South Atlantic. So we host this web forum every third Thursday of the month right here at 10 a.m. It's intended to give folks like you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of our region. So here's our agenda for this morning. I'll start by introducing our speakers who are going to give us about a 30-minute presentation. I'm going to chime in to touch on where you can go to access the data from their project. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion after that, and then we'll wrap up with a preview of next month's webinar and a few updates from Blueprint staff. So a couple of logistics. I'm going to keep us in silent mode just for John and Anne's talk so we don't get background noise, but I'll unmute everybody for the Q&A. So if you do have questions, you can either hold them until we pause for questions, or you can use the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout the talk. So before I mute everybody, does anyone have any questions or comments? All right.
The conference is now in silent mode.
So presenting today, we have Anne Chazal, who's the Species Modeling Project Manager for the Virginia Department of Natural Heritage, or for the Virginia Natural Heritage Program, and Jon Oetting, who's the Conservation Planner for the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. So they're going to be presenting today about the results of their project to model 10 different at-risk species in the South Atlantic. We got an interim progress report from them in June of last year that you may have been part of, so I'm really excited to hear about the final methods and products today. So Anne and John, you can take it away. Just please remember to hit *6 to unmute your line. We may not have you unmuted yet, guys. Just hit *6 on your phone.
Hi.
Can you hear me now?
This is John. Can you hear me?
Sure can. Thank you.
Great. And do I have the ball?
I will hand that over to you now. That's going to Anne.
Great. Thanks. Well, thanks, y'all, for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time out to hear what we've been doing. Hoping you can see the screen okay. And
I don't think we have you sharing yet.
Okay.
Let's see if we go into share application and click the blue arrow.
I thought I did that.
Let's see.
Share up on the right. See up on the right corner. Share.
No, that's sharing the link. Hang on.
No worries. At the top of your WebEx menu, there should be a thing that says Quick Start. There we go.
You see it now?
You're coming through. Yep.
Okay. So let me go here and here.
Beautiful.
Okay. Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Sorry for the slow start. Again, John and I are presenting on what we have been working on in over the last couple of years. And I first want to give some thanks out to all the people who worked on this. Now, we had people from Pennsylvania and New York and Florida and Virginia all working together to develop these methods that we're going to talk about today. And the reason we had all these people together is because we had essentially two concurrent modeling projects, but two different projects. So we had New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. We worked on a project with Region 5, the Fish and Wildlife Service, to model 7 different species. And Florida and Virginia, we worked together to model 10 different species. And so we just came together as this kind of Eastern regional modeling team to develop methods. So we had similar methods, and we used similar environmental data, or the exact same environmental data, but they were different projects. So the goals of, we had 2 broad goals for this project. The immediate goal was just to improve the connection and incorporate at-risk and range-restricted species into the blueprint by building models of potential habitat. And the second was really to help kind of a long-term effort of beginning to build a modeling library, both the input data and the output of the model, so that it can be maintained and iteratively improved. I'm going to really quickly go through the methods as fast as I can so we can focus on the results. The methods were discussed in more detail back in June when we did the progress update. So we'll just hit on highlights of some of the things. So the first was how we picked the species. We started with all G1 species, basically, and federally listed species across the South Atlantic region. And then we kind of removed things that were really data deficient and also that would require different types of models. For example, riverine species would take something very different to do. So we focused on terrestrial. And once we removed G3 through G5 federally listed species, we got down to about 27 species. And we ran that by a group that RUA pulled together from the cooperative, and together we worked to get down to 10 species that you see there on the right. Really simply stated, species distribution model has kind of just 3 different parts for the input. First, you start with your known locations, and we used typical heritage EOs or the polygons, and we also got data from elsewhere. Each of those polygons was given some randomly distributed presence points that became the training data. We used pseudo-absence or background locations, which were also randomly distributed points across the entire region as our absence points. And then we had developed 88 different environmental variables as predictor layers at 30-meter resolution. We used random forest. It handles rare species really well. Keep in mind that it's not a regression, but it's a classification tree model, and it enables us to handle and input data differently. For example, it kind of can handle the kitchen sink approach of throwing all those environmental variables at it. It may include many variables that really don't impact the species, but sometimes you don't know until you actually run the model. What comes out is important. And another advantage or difference with random forest is that correlated variables really don't impact the model as they might for regression analysis. And lastly, random forest can handle kind of multiple solutions across the geography. For example, if something's doing something different on the coast as it does in the mountains, it will be able to pick that up and model that out pretty well. Lastly, the output is a raster of probabilities or of similar conditions being present as are found at the known locations. And that raster, the cell values range from 0 to 1. So we received data from a lot of different sources, getting over 2,000 potential polygons that had to be reviewed by each biologist. Virginia took a set of species and Florida took a set of species. That way we'd be consistent within a species as we did this editing and review. And we've had to think through a lot of different issues, and we developed with Florida and Pennsylvania kind of a guidelines document to help us think through some of this. For example, how old was too old? Where do we cut that off? If we heard a frog crawling from a wetland, should we infer the wetland or should we just keep it as a point? A snake crossing the road, the road isn't really biologically meaningful to the snake, so how do we capture adjacent area? Those sorts of questions were discussed and answered and guidelines given so that we could come up with the best biologically meaningful polygons that we possibly could as input. And lastly, each polygon was assigned a representational accuracy. This is a very heritagey jargon word. I might say RA occasionally in the talk. Essentially, RA is a qualitative value from very low to very high that reflects the certainty that the map location represents the actual observed location. For example, if you GPS a point and you know you're pretty much spot on within just a few meters, you would have a very high RA. But if you have a polygon that's mapped to represent an area just described on a museum specimen as pine woods 1 mile north of town, that might get a medium or even a low RA depending on how large that polygon is. Again, I mentioned that we had 88 different predictor variables developed, and these are just the different classifications that they kind of went to, the categories. And these were developed concurrently with the input presence polygons. Each program took a set so that there would be consistency again within the variable, and they were developed from Maine to Florida, again, as part of this regional effort, Eastern regional effort. So there was a consistent set. And many of these were calculated as distance to provide continuous variables. For example, distance to river or distance to loam, or most of those were probably geology sort of variables, and land, maybe land cover. So we had several decision points we had to we wrestled with, and just to highlight some of those, we wanted to give more weight to the higher precision occurrence data. So we included more presence samples from the polygons with higher EOs or higher RAs. Each time random forest would pull a sample, it would pull more often from the higher RAs. For environmental variables, we started to ignore rasters that were far away from known locations because they were probably not biologically relevant. We also wrestled with what thresholds we should, statistical thresholds we should use. We finally settled in on using 2 minimum training presence and the maximum sensitivity and specificity. But there were a lot of different options. And where am I? We discussed whether to start the environmental subset based on each of the species biology, but Random Forest does a good job of handling, again, all of those environmental variables. So eventually we did determine to drop the least important 25% and then run the model, but we did still throw in a bunch of variables at it. And lastly, when Random Forest runs into a classification tree, at each node of decision, it pulls a random sample of, not at each node, at each tree beginning, it pulls a random sample of presence points and background points. We decided to make those equal in number so that we could avoid swamping the data. So 3 main products from the model. The raster of probabilities is shown there in the lower left. The validation statistics and the metadata. And we'll run through a little bit about the metadata here, which includes the validation statistics. Ooh, well, I'm going to go through the raster first, apparently. So this is an example of the output raster. I call this a full spectrum because every cell has a color. And again, every cell has a value from 0 to 1, reflecting essentially the probability that suitable habitat conditions are present. Values approaching 1 or more likely to be suitable. You can see I've put a few of the known locations for the species in here and how they get mapped. We consider this sensitive data because if you were to give this full raster to somebody, they could choose the classification so low that they could actually start picking up areas of where the species are located. So we do consider this sensitive. All right, and then back to the metadata. Each model has a 5-page metadata package pulled together. The metadata should always be shared with the model if you're sharing the model out with somebody so that they can understand what's going on. I'm going to touch on just a few of the aspects. The validation statistics are basically here and include things like specificity, sensitivity, and true skill statistics. But highlighting this figure over here, this is an important graph of how the environmental variables, how important the environmental variables are to that species in order. So the ones at the top are the most important. This tells you the importance, but it doesn't really give you an idea of what direction. For example, it says precipitation of the coldest quarter. Well, that doesn't tell you if that precipitation is really wet or really dry. So to help with that, for at least the first 9 variables, we've developed these partial plots. This will help indicate the directionality. So each plot shows the effect of the variable on the probability of appropriate habitat, with the effects of the other variables removed. So that's what this black line is. So you remove all the other variables. This is how precipitation in the coldest quarter affects it. It looks like it's pretty middle of the road, either too wet or too dry. And then the blue line here are the presence points and how they're reacting to this variable, and the red line are the background points. So you can get an idea of how they're reacting to these different variables. We do include in the metadata a map of the full spectrum. And again, I mentioned the full spectrum as a data set should not be shared out, but at this scale, a static map is fine to share out. The darker blues showing higher probabilities of suitable habitat. And then we have a table of what we suggest as suitable threshold values. A threshold value is a cell value that you choose above which the values above which would be considered suitable and below which would be considered unsuitable. That way you get a binary output for your raster, and that will help to hide or alleviate this problem of sensitive data, and also just gives you some idea and some approximation of how you might want to use the data, and I'll go into that in just a minute. First, I'm going to show you just a little conceptually of how some of these things are to be thought of and what the different values and what they mean. So equal sensitivity and maximum sensitivity plus specificity, which I refer to as MSS, both take into account true negative and true positive. So I have a few slides to kind of demonstrate this. And these slides are actually taken from a bog turtle data set and not from a data set that we worked on, but the concept is the same. So we start with an area, and every single raster shell has a value above 0, and so it has a color red, and these blue are the known locations for the species. And as I said, we would populate those with randomly distributed presence points here in the green and randomly distributed background points here in the black. So what we are hoping for is that we get 100% truly classified presence points are actually classified as present or in suitable habitat, and the background points are actually classified as not present or not suitable. So this every single one, if you don't use the threshold at all, has a color. So you're getting all the presence points are correctly classified, but all these background points are not correctly classified. So it's down here at 0. If we choose a threshold of a very low threshold of 0, I'm sorry about that slide thing there, you can see that it turns white, and you start to grab some of these background points, and they're starting to be correctly classified as truly negative. And so that brings this up a little bit, but all our presence points are still classified correctly as present. If we bump it up a little more, you get a little more white. You're increasing this. The true negatives are increasing. Our presence are maintaining. You bump it up a little bit more and a little bit more again, and you can see the white is starting to creep in. So if I have a threshold of about 0.9, which is where this is, you can see, or actually earlier than that, some of these presence points started to be incorrectly classified as within non-suitable. If I classify, but more and more of the background points are being correctly classified. And one more time again, and you can see how the curves go, and it becomes these curves here. Equal sensitivity and specificity. Again, this data is not for any of our species here, but this is just for example's sake. Is where the difference between this curve and that curve is minimized, is where this point is. I think that's right. And then for maximum specificity and sensitivity plus specificity, it's where, well, you add them together and where the maximum is. So that's where this point is. So that gives just a little overview of how those two values are derived. And again, those use both true negative and true positive. With the MTP, though, the minimum training presence, our data, our best data are the known locations, and so focusing on kind of the true positives makes some sort of sense. And so we looked at the minimum training presence, and I'll go into how these were calculated. But when we just did the minimum training presence, we noticed that some values were really, really low because the presence points within the polygon were so close to low value raster shells. So we developed two other methods, presence by polygon, which I may call MTPP, or minimum training presence by element occurrence, or EO. So I have a few slides to conceptualize this as well. Now, this is just a concept. This isn't actual data. So this is looking at the MTP options. You have 3 polygons, but again, these two would be one EO, and this would be another. For MTP, you just look at the presence points, which are the green dots. You find the minimum training point value that would capture all the others, and in this case, it would be 0.4. And so everything above 0.4 would become, quote, suitable, and you make a raster as shown on the right, and it covers an awful lot of area, but it definitely covers all the presence points of the 2 known ones. So we wanted to be a little tighter about that, so we went with minimum training presence by polygon, which we'll consider the metric by polygon rather than the presence points. So to be the calculation first, it summarizes the maximum probability from each polygon, and then it finds the minimum value from that set. So the maximum from this polygon is 0.7, from this one it's 0.9, and from this one it's 0.8. So from that set of 7, 9, and 8, the minimum of that is 0.7. So if we reclassify as shown in this raster, everything above 0.7 becomes suitable, and everything below it becomes unsuitable. You can see that we start to cut off some of the polygons of known areas. It may be that this is actually the best habitat within how this polygon was mapped. I don't know, but it's possible, but it's something to keep in mind as you're thinking through these different threshold values. Lastly, we did it by EO as opposed to by polygon. So remembering that together these polygons make up one EO, we took the maximum value from this EO, which is 0.9, and from this EO, which is 0.8, and we took the minimum of that. So we used 0.8 to derive this binary raster. And again, start to notice that it's reduced even more within the polygon. So this polygon is completely missed. So it's really tight, and it becomes could become really obvious where the EO is as you get tighter and tighter. But it's just something to think about. All right, so finally, this is just showing the full model and thinking about choosing a threshold. So where you set the threshold depends on the models used. For example, you might want a lower threshold that selects a little more area if you're developing a screening coverage or something for project review. However, informing something like field inventory to find new occurrences, you probably want to use something with the higher probability of suitable habitat or higher threshold value. The images here show the full model and 2 potential screening coverages. So the first is with a lower one that you might want to use for project review. You can see these are the known locations for this species, and most of them are contained within this lower one, but it is grabbing an awful lot of extra habitat for potential project review, which would mean someone else, a biologist, should actually look at it. But taking the highest threshold value of 0.9 for this species, these might be better areas to highlight for inventory, or maybe reintroduction, or finding other suitable habitats for reintroduction, or maybe even for some resiliency exercises, such as purchasing land around known occurrences. But you see it does miss a couple of polygons here, so that would need to be carefully reviewed. All right, so that's really the methods in a nutshell, so I'm going to pass it off to John.
Okay, thanks, Anne. So we're going to walk through each of the species we modeled and look at the results for those. But just to start off, I wanted to again outline the deliverables that we provided to the LCC for this project, and these are all available for any of you to review and use as you see fit. So in addition to the actual data, we provided reports for each species where we kind of summarized the current status status of the species, what the primary threats are, and some potential actions that would benefit the species, including, land acquisition, management, and so on. For the model data, we provide sort of an assessment of how the model performed, how well it met the requirements of sort of the positive and negative identification, and some additional areas that could be considered for inclusion into the blueprint. As Anne noted at the beginning, that was one of our goals. And then finally, the actual model data itself. We provided the full rasters, again, which are sensitive data, and different threshold layers, which could be used for different purposes, as Anne noted. So we can go ahead, Anne, if you want to click ahead, and we'll go in and look at some of the individual species results. So here's the flatwood salamander and Bistema. It ranges from Florida into South Carolina. And on the left-hand side, for each of these models, we're showing the full model spectrum for the South Atlantic study area, with blue being the lowest probabilities up to the bright yellow being the highest, and the actual red dots are the actual input occurrence data that we used for the model. And then on the right-hand side, we've got thresholds split out, so you can see those different thresholds that Anne described are shown in gradations on that side. So you can see that in this case, all of those thresholds from lowest to highest are all fairly tightly, staying pretty localized around the known data, at least at this scale. Once you zoom in, you can really start to see some additional areas identified around and in between some of those known occurrences. But that just gives you a sense of how this data breaks out in terms of the full spectrum versus those recommended thresholds. In this case, for flatwood salamander, most of the known populations of the species are on conservation lands already, so land management is really more of the key here, and so potentially the model is suitable for kind of identifying areas within those conservation lands that are immediately around those populations. Next slide. Okay, next we have the smooth coneflower, and this is a species that ranges from sort of extreme northern Georgia up through Virginia. And so again, you can see the full model spectrum on the left, and you can kind of see sort of some distinct general areas of occurrence for the species. And then on the right-hand side, you can see, and here you can see it's kind of interesting that most of those thresholds are fairly low in the 0.5 range, except once you get up into our strictest threshold, the MTP by EOs, then you jump up to 0.9. So you have a fair range there if you want to consider sort of those broader ranges for a screening layer versus the really tight range for your kind of highest level decision making. And in this case, this is a species where we think the model could be useful for additional inventory work to identify new potential habitat, or potentially areas where introductions could occur for the species. Next slide. Okay, southern hognose snake. This is a fairly wide-ranging species in xeric habitats, and so you would expect more area to be identified for the species. And interestingly, on the right-hand side, you see where the breaks are. That through the northern part of this study area in North Carolina, South Carolina, getting into Georgia, it does identify a fair amount of habitat. Down in the southern part in Florida and southern Georgia, there was less occurrence data to begin with, and you see the model identifying really very little habitat beyond those known occurrences. My guess is it's probably underestimating the species in that area. We know it's a more wide-ranging species. The key here is that the species just isn't well surveyed. It's more difficult to collect survey data on the species, and so it's most likely broader ranging than what we're seeing here. So that's just something to keep in mind when you think about you want to bring your individual species interpretation and context into these models. Next slide. Okay, this is pondberry. Again, this is one where it ranges fairly widely from Georgia through North Carolina, but it's highly restricted in terms of the suitable habitat within that range. And also, this is a species that's potentially a threat due to the laurel wilt disease, and so it's likely, rapidly declining even within these known areas. So in this case, there's need for additional land protection and survey and monitoring for the species. So I think the model could be particularly useful for identifying new populations and new sites for establishment of populations, as well as areas where you want to direct habitat management for the benefit of this species in particular. Next slide. Gopher frog. So this is another upland species, and in this case, similar to salamander, the key is the small breeding wetlands. And so that was our focus as we were trying to key in on the suitable habitat for the species, is identifying those small suitable wetlands, breeding wetlands. And here, again, you can see a good range between the lower and higher thresholds. So you have kind of a range of decision points that could be used there. In this case, it's possible that the result, it looks like a pretty tight result, but when you really zoom in on it, it's identifying a fair amount of area in the vicinity of those wetlands. And so it's possible that we're not keying in quite tightly enough on the breeding wetlands. Although, of course, these amphibian species or herb species, they need the upland habitat surrounding those wetlands, so it's not necessarily a bad thing that that's getting picked up. But again, this is a species that most of its known populations are on conservation land, so it's more of a land management issue in this case. Next slide. Okay, Curtis loosestrife is a fairly highly restricted plant species in Florida and southern Georgia. In this case, you'll notice that the thresholds, both the MTP and MSS came out at the same level, and then the polygon and EO MTP came out at the same high level. So we don't have as many tiers to use to distinguish, decision points for the species. And that occurs in some cases, especially where you have, I think, a highly restricted habitat like this with not as many occurrence points. But again, there's need for sort of additional surveys for potential habitat for the species, so hopefully the model would be helpful in guiding those areas. Next slide. And I'm going to try to keep kind of moving quickly through these since we're bumping up on our time. So here's the striped newt. Again, similar to flatwood salamander, this is using small breeding wetlands within larger upland areas. And here we've got a range from a 0.7 up to the 0.95 for the thresholds. And in the areas where we have several occurrence populations, it is identifying a fair amount of habitat beyond and between those. You see that in northeast Florida and some in Georgia. And this is another species where pretty much all of the known populations are on conservation lands, and it's really a matter of fire management and other land management issues, maintaining those wetlands and avoiding disturbance to those wetlands. That's going to be key for this species. Next slide. This is a very highly restricted plant species in sort of southwest Virginia, moving into North Carolina. And you can see there, once you break it down into the thresholds, it's barely identifying any habitat at all. And Anne is pointing out that there is an occurrence point there in North Carolina, and the model is identifying habitat around it. At this scale, you can't really see, but you can see how sensitive these data could be in terms of essentially directing you towards the known occurrences of the species. Next slide. Okay, so in this case, we've got at the lower threshold, you're seeing a lot of additional habitat identified there in North Carolina. So this is a case where, although those are lower probabilities, it still could be interesting to look at in terms of additional area for surveys and potential new populations in those areas. Next slide. And then finally, we've got chaff seed or Schwalbia. This is a species that was historically quite wide-ranging. It went throughout the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, so it experienced considerable habitat loss. And this is one where you've got a good balance, I think, of thresholds from lower to higher levels. So you have a lot of sort of decision levels there in terms of how you'd like to use the data. Next slide. So just wrapping up with some summaries here. Here we're seeing the South Atlantic blueprint data in the pink grades, and what we've just shown is in the yellow and red sort of an overlay of our species habitat models for this project. And you can see that there is a nice complementarity there where they're identifying some areas outside of what had previously been identified in the blueprint. So hopefully that is serving the purpose that we were shooting for with this project, where we're able to identify some additional conservation priorities that could be considered for the blueprint. I think that's where the LCC is at now, and considering how these might fit in with that. Next slide. We did want to hit on a couple of known issues that we're aware of that need to be considered going forward with interpreting these results as well as modeling in general. One of the things that we talked about a lot and we think needs to be taken into account in future modeling efforts is temporal issues. So imagine if you're incorporating older occurrence data that's 40, 50 or more years old, and you're overlaying that on essentially current environmental conditions with your predictive data. There just may not be a match there, especially in terms of, if some of your environmental predictors are based on land cover, that's obviously probably changed. Even climate data we know is changing, and so that could be out of sync. So ideally, we would be able to find some historical environmental predictor data that would sync up with those older occurrence data. And we've played around with that a little bit and don't have any sort of definitive results, but I think that's a promising direction to go here with modeling. In this particular project, we weren't able to pull in soils data directly. We worked within our CS to try to get kind of a large library of soils data for it, but we weren't able to pull it in time to get it included in the model. We do have other features, physiographic and geological features that probably are adequate surrogates in this case, but ideally you'd want to have soils data in there as well. So that's something we'll continue to push for in our sort of environmental predictor library. As Anne mentioned, some of these variables are highly correlated. That's not an issue specifically for random forest, because as it's running through different iterations, it's sort of randomly selecting subsets of those variables and looking at how they're impacting the model. So it's not directly going to swamp the model like it would with a regression model, but it's still something to keep in mind. I mean, if you had 90% of your environmental predictor data were all sort of autocorrelating, then it's inevitably going to have influence your outcome. So it's something you want to keep in mind. And then, as Anne mentioned, we did use sort of a standard set of those 88 variables for the modeling across all of these species. And there obviously could be cases where you've got some really unique environmental conditions that are unique to a species that you might want to try to capture, and we'd like to be able to do more of that. Next slide. So just a few final thoughts from where we're at now versus when we presented back in the summer. We think these models are really useful in terms of both surveying known locations and identifying potentially new locations. And it also informs how we ought to be surveying in terms of improving how we're mapping occurrences in terms of our heritage methodology, and being more consistent in terms of how we're assigning our precision and viability ranks for those occurrences. The better those data are, then the better our models are going to be coming out of there. As we talked about, we do feel like that this has been beneficial from the blueprint perspective, that it does identify some additional areas that could be added. So it does kind of support the coarse filter, fine filter approach to conservation, where in addition to sort of large landscape values and priorities, it's worth bringing in some of these range-restricted species to make sure they're not missed in the larger picture. And finally, we just wanted to say that, another larger goal we had was sort of establishing a process of this modeling, being rigorous about our methods and reviewing our input data, and developing kind of a bank of environmental predictor data that can be used going forward. And we're really pleased with how that all has come together. So our programs and actually many others across the NatureServe network are now in a position to do a lot of this modeling. Next slide. So we wanted to just acknowledge some of our contributors in terms of data, as well as reviewing some of the models, and those are listed here. Next slide. And finally, just an additional thanks to the South Atlantic LCC for funding this project and recognizing the value that it could bring to the blueprint process. And that's it.
Great, thanks you guys. Great presentation. So exciting to see those model results. Before we pause for questions, I'm going to take back the presenter power here just briefly to show where you're going to be able to go to get this data. Unfortunately, we as staff were not able to get the data up on the Conservation Planning Atlas before today's webinar. We've really had our heads down as staff working on helping some blueprint users the last couple of weeks, and that's been taking up most of our time. But in the next week or two, we are going to get the data up on the Conservation Planning Atlas. So I wanted to be sure I showed you where you could go to find that. Can you guys see my browser window?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Amy says yes in the office. Thank you. So I'm just going to take you to the Conservation Planning Atlas homepage, salcc.databasin.org. Hopefully most of you all are familiar with our Conservation Planning Atlas. This is kind of like our online alternative to ArcGIS, where we house all of our spatial data. So we're going to put it all packaged up and organized in a gallery, and we're going to feature that gallery. So it should be showing up here under recommended items on the home page of the CPA. And just to give you an example of what another data looks like, a data gallery looks like, this is what our blueprint data gallery is. So we'll have it all kind of organized and packaged up here for you, where you can play with it in a map live on this viewer, or you can download the parts of the data that are publicly shareable onto your own ArcGIS machine. So that's kind of where you'll go to get the data once it's up. And we do have everybody's email address from logging into the WebEx today. So anyone who is on this webinar, I will directly email a link to that data gallery. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions for Anne and Jon. I'm going to take us off of silent mode, so please be mindful of your mute button and watch the background noise here.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So now you are free to speak up if you have a question for Anne and Jon, or please feel free to use the chat.
Hey, this is Scott Wiggers, and over in Mississippi, and I just have a question about. You mentioned that the publicly available data will be available on Databasin, but what about the actual code for these models? Because speaking for my species, this clearly needs a lot more work, and so I'd like to maybe have the opportunity to actually modify it, update it. And also maybe expand some of the range that it's actually applicable for. And so also the other question is the reports that were mentioned, the ones that are basically the species assessments. are those going to be on database and are available through a different channel?
Hillary, you want to talk the report? Will that be on databases?
Yeah, those should be accessible in database, and we'll load them onto ScienceBase.
Yeah, and I can help with that too. We haven't got them up yet, and so there might be some details that change, but the reports will definitely be available for download. And once we get them up, we'll be able to walk you through how to get to them. For the code, Anne, is that something that you're comfortable sharing out? Is that one that's public or private?
I think we'll have some internal discussion about that. Scott, there are a lot of the methodologies, and I think even the GitHub site that the code's at, it's in the report. But I will also say that we'd love to do the modeling for you. We have heritage partners in Alabama, and as Pondberry extends out that way, that can help with the modeling if needed. We don't have the environmental data that needs to be developed for that, so that could be a little pricey if you don't have it already. But the Heritage Network is setting up and is in a very good position to do that, if that's something you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that I'm interested in. The only thing is, you said the key word, which is pricey, and you're probably well aware that funding is not exactly something that we are particularly flush with as a whole right now, and it's likely going to get worse. So as much as I hate to say it, it's like the outlook for us funding things like this in the future is probably not looking all that great, and so we're probably going to have to do things more in-house, and so that's kind of one of those things where we may have to look for alternative partnerships for how we can do this, other than just us paying somebody else to do it. And so I know that we all need funds and money, but we've got to be able to adapt and make these things more useful for certain species. And it's got to be something other than just us paying somebody at this point. I mean, because we have no idea what the funding is going to be like, but it's probably not going to be good.
Right. Well, this may be a great venue to point out that NatureServe as a whole, as a network, we are not only pursuing higher levels at Fish and Wildlife Service to eventually model every T&E species across the lower 48, but right now we are almost have signed the bottom line with a contract with Esri, which will do kind of a mini step in between there, kind of a quick and dirty modeling for globally rare species across the lower 48. But part of that would be developing environmental variables across that. So we would have that full data set available to us. Be a year away or so, but if that becomes the case, at that point the efficiency of scale would really skyrocket. So just to point that out, I realize that you probably prefer to have the data here and now, right, as soon as you could get it, but we're hoping that would be something within a year that would really reduce the price for running these models, or even give you capacity to do it yourself.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. That's actually encouraging to hear about.
Yep.
Yeah. Hello, this is Kurt Buellman. Can you hear me?
Kurt Buellman.
Yeah. Hey, hello. I'm calling from the Savannah River site, and I thought this modeling is really great in terms of its opportunity to identify large landscapes that need jump out for conservation. And what I sometimes worry about, though, is when we get down to the individual species. We have 25 years of great natural heritage surveys plus historic museum records and all, and I worry that sometimes we're identifying a lot of suitable sites, but really truly the only occupied site are the small sites we've already identified. And I just worry that sometimes presenting this to people outside of this program, they will confuse suitable with occupied and think that the range is potentially greater than in reality some of us feel it is. Southern hognose snakes, I know John made a comment that maybe there's more out there than we think. I tend to argue that maybe there's fewer out there than that, But so I just wonder how you parse the occupied versus suitable and make sure that those differences are made.
I think that's an excellent point, Kurt. And we do try to make that distinction as much as we possibly can, that it's potential suitable habitat, and then there's not at all a species presence model. And, you know, when you get to things like project review and things like that, it's always nice to have an eye open, but but the model is never the final answer. You should kick it to a biologist, and the biologist can say, yeah, I've looked there, it's not there, or I've been there and it's actually not suitable, or whatever. So it's only a guideline. It's only one tool in the toolbox. So I think that we don't want to oversell it. I also think there is a lot of power to it.
I agree. Thanks very much. Yeah, I like the idea of we focus on protecting the occupied sites, but you clearly identified, these suitable sites, identify possible reintroduction sites and things like that in the future. I think that's great.
Yeah, and I'd love the model to be used as kind of incorporated into some resiliency sorts of actions around known sites. You pick up the better habitat, potentially focus on the better habitat around known locations to pick up in protection.
Okay.
Yeah, this is John. I just wanted to add a comment. I agree as well. That's a good point, and it's important to distinguish between the sort of documented known populations and these models. I would just add, though, that if you compare these to kind of more traditional land cover-based potential habitat models, that those tend to identify quite a bit more area. And so this is really helping us focus in more on those higher suitable areas. But yes, you still need to be careful to distinguish between what's modeled and what's known.
Thanks. Agree. It's great.
Probably time for one more question if someone wants to chime in.
Yes, I have a question. This is April Puntalon. Since you all have a more intimate connection with the models, how would you recommend incorporating some of this information into a 5-year review? Because I'm doing a 5-year review for Schwabia, and I want to mention the model, but I've been thinking about how to present that and which parts to present, so I don't know if you all have any recommendations.
April, off the top of my head, when you pick up the report, we do have some comments in there. I don't know for Schwabia off the top of my head in particular, but we do include comments and recommendations. And they are pretty general. They're not too specific, but if you wanted to read that first and then I can reread it myself and then give us a call, maybe that will be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, that's also something just for me to think about. Let me cogitate on that and try to get back with you.
All right, sounds great. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is, I sat in on the Helonius Ballata conference call, and that was very helpful just to talk about one model and some of the values, the importance of the different variables. Would we be able to do that for Schwabia as well in the future?
Sure, be happy to.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Anybody else have a quick one? Well, thanks again, Anne and John. Fabulous presentation, really good discussion here. I am just going to pause to preview the upcoming webinar for next month. That's going to be on April 19th, so same time, same connection information. Rua and I will be giving that talk, and it's really intended to guide you through step-by-step how you might use the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint and the CCAS Conservation Blueprint to make your proposals more competitive. So you've probably heard us talk a lot about how the blueprint has helped folks in the conservation community bring in new resources to fund things like land acquisition and their management actions. You've probably heard a few of those examples, like supporting National Coastal Wetlands Conservation grants for a few state DNRs, applications for the Department of Interior's prescribed fire program. And so we'd like to dive a little deeper into some of those examples and kind of walk you through how you can use the blueprint, the underlying indicators, future threat projections, and other types of supporting data to make your proposals more competitive. So that's what's on deck for next month. And then Rua's going to give us a quick update on some new data sets that are coming available on the CPA soon. Rua?
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. So as Hillary mentioned, we've been pretty head down on just helping a whole bunch of different Blueprint users lately. And so as part of some of those efforts, there's a number of sort of new resources that we want to try to share more broadly based on some of the assessments we've done, including some GIS on military training route locations, some more things related to fire, and a few other things that have come out. So hoping maybe by the next newsletter or something like that, we'll have a few more resources that might be helpful for you that came out of helping some of our various Blueprint users. So keep an eye out for that. And then also just a nice comment about the great work that Anne and Jon. This is a nice example of where within the Blueprint we went in and we tested the current indicators and found a few specific. These species were some of the types of range restricted species that were not being captured by PNC resilience and some of those other components that are intended to do that. And so the other thing that we're kind of doing is trying to get some of this new information, new improvements, and fold it in to make the next generation of the Blueprint. So it's nice to see that full cycle of testing things, finding something falls through the crack, getting new information, and then we'll be trying to fold this into the next versions. That's it for me.
Great, thanks, Rua. So as always, I would definitely love for you to get more involved in the Blueprint. I encourage you to join our web community at southatlanticlcc.org and get signed up for the monthly newsletter and a monthly reminder email about this web forum. You can still connect with your Blueprint staff, me, Rua, Amy, Mallory, talk to other members of the cooperative, and of course, we encourage you to explore the Blueprint online as well. With that, I see that it is 10:58. We are supposedly getting a tornado drill here in Raleigh at 11, and so I don't want to subject you guys to the loud beeping that is likely to happen at any moment on our end. But if someone wants to jump in with a question in 2 minutes or less, please feel free. All right. Well, that's it for us today. Please keep an eye out on your email for a link to all of this data and the final report. Thanks again, Anne and Jon. Appreciate you guys tuning in today. Hope to see you in April.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.